Our next talk is by my colleague, John Karavas, who is the current teacher of the sports class that we've been discussing. John is an archaeologist and historian on let's say the edges of the provinces, and has excavated for many years at Halmyras of the Delta of the Danube.
Indeed, the very end of the Greco-Roman world as we know it, so in many respects.
Over to you.
Thank you, Robert. And should I also add from my own part that it's been an absolute pleasure and also a privilege to be the one currently carrying the torch when it comes over to the class on ancient Greek sports. Many of you, in fact, might know that the study of ancient Greek athletics has been an integral part of CYA's academic curriculum from the time of its original introduction in 1994 by Professor Kenton, all throughout, in fact, the tenure of my good friend and colleague, Nigel Kennel, and in addition, of course, to many of our notable visible scholars in the form of Barbara Rieger, Wolfgang Decker, and last but certainly not least, Stephen Miller, may, of course, he rest in peace. So when it comes over to my own contribution, let's just say that it is more of the educational, the methodological, and the pedagogical sort of variety. What I essentially try to do as much as possible is, and I'm a firm advocate of this approach, is to try and introduce a hands-on, experiential, and also experimental component in how the source material is actually taught. If you're wondering, this is not by itself a novel, nor is it unique. To some extent, I draw heavily on the work done by some of my contemporary colleagues, the likes of Professors Krenza, Matthews, Murphy, Polyakov, and the list of goes on. And dare I say that one perhaps thing that differs my work from them is that within my classroom, we tend to explore every single ancient Greek event under the sun, with the exception of the equestrian competition. So sorry, David, my contribution when it comes over to the topic would have been infinitesimally small. I have to say, and again, from my own personal perspective, that my decision to give it this kind of direction was not arbitrary, and was not only the result of my personal preference. To many regards, it has to do with what, in fact, our partner institutions keep on asking, that has to do with a more interdisciplinary approach when we teach the course material. That is a reason why today, and as we speak, the sports class usually has a class enrollment of 20 to 24 students. Some of them are still classics or classics-oriented students. However, the majority of them seem to be by relative disciplines that would include course kinesiology, physical education, sports science, nutrition, diet, and the list goes on. The second reason has to do with repeated student feedback and evaluation, most of which clearly seem to thirst for more active or interactive learning. And I have to admit that my own personal experience, this has actually worked wonders. One thing that I've consistently found when it comes over to student assessments is the fact that students definitely get a better understanding of the subject material. They seem, in fact, to be handling it well, regardless of what major or discipline they might come from. This obviously translates over to good news when it comes to knowledge retention. But once again, in the form of their assignments, one thing that I always try to inspire within my class is the idea of problem solving, is the idea of creating what is the equivalent of think tanks. So we can look at the evidence, we can perform all of the reenactments, and therefore think of any sort of variations or permutations that might be brought forward as we go along, alongside with a very basic instinct of intuition, which might give us a better understanding about what the material content is all about. The third one is that, much like any other discipline, ours, at least in my view, is always a evolving one. And I have been very lucky throughout my 12 years of teaching this class of being able to enlist on the expertise of people who currently deal with sports science or sports science at large, but equally with the help and advice of professional trainers and athletes, some of which happen to be of the highest caliber, that in their own way have been able to talk to students and discuss some of the challenges, the peculiarities, or the particularities that obviously they themselves encounter when they perform each of these individual sports. However, and that being said, because by trade and by education, I am an ancient historian, all of this interactive component is always done after a close investigation, examination, and scrutiny of our available primary sources, be it of the pictorial representation or also of the literary variety, where just in fact to give you the gist of what we essentially do is, once of course we do have what is an actual representation, this most likely corresponds over to the ancient event of Pankration, a mixed martial arts. What in fact we attempt to do and reenact with my students is, how do we get there? And most importantly, what its natural conclusion would be, with all the possible variations thrown into the equation. So, as a kind of, or to demonstrate examples of what we do within the classroom, I have chosen certain of the events that relate over to the ancient Greek running competitions, the ones that relate over to pentathlon, 2 out of the 5, and last but not least, one representative example of a combat sport, in this case, of course, wrestling. When it comes to the running competitions, they usually prove to be the most straightforward and equally least challenging of the affairs. All of my students are being taught on the basis, of course, of a material culture of how to assume the proper stand on the actual blocks. This always in reference or adding in factor of the archaeological evidence that we have with regard to the fatires, the patiras, the starting blocks, alongside with the valvides, which are essentially the grooves in which the athletes would plant over the feet. And last but certainly not least, once it is introduced within ancient stadia, the existence of the hisplex, the elaborate starting mechanism that, just to cut a long story short, would ensure a fair start for all of the athletes who partake in these running competitions. By the way, let me just throw it out there because I have to. I have never been a fan of a straight leg in the back. Actually, we have always found it to be counterintuitive and productive when our students are about, in fact, to race. Regardless of that, the things that I mostly pay attention on has to do with the proper technique, which once again is borne by our pictorial evidence. I always insist that once in fact they're off the blocks, all of the students tend to assume what is an upright position with their upper body. I am almost maniacal about them being able to do what you could consider as the 90-degree angles that see a synchronicity between the way in which you use your arms and indeed your legs. I tend to believe that the open and flat palm is one of the things that will always help you maintain the tempo as you're working. And last but not least, once of course the students are right now becoming better acquainted and are able to better absorb the proper running technique, where I tend to always focus about the way that they tend to run by always using their forefoot, I think for obvious reasons. One, to always maintain that forward kinetic propulsion moving forward, but at the same time considering that in ancient games, ancient in fact tracks would have been made out of hard clay or out of dirt. This is one of the ways in which you can ensure they do not suffer any ankle injuries. And this, dare I say, has also been partly confirmed by many of the professional athletes and sprinters that we have used all throughout the course of this. Another aspect that I tend to also focus on has to do with strategy. It has to do with tactics. Not all ancient Greek athletes or modern athletes are born equal. Some have certain, let's say, kind of advantages. Some have other limitations. You must always try and perform, or at least I try to convince my class, to the best of your ability by coming up with a plan that will help you enhance your advantages, at the same time, not highlight your limitations. This obviously is the reason why I often have many of my students who compete against each other. To be honest, I couldn't care less about their actual performance. What I care about is the concept and the execution and implementation of a strategy that will outline your strengths as opposed to limitation. And these are the sort of competitions that obviously become even more paramount when I introduce them to the basics of the second major running competition, the diablos, essentially more or less a 400-yard dash that would have involved one turn around a turning post, in which, let's be honest, once you have all of the athletes starting at the same lane, if we consider that the lanes could have numbered anywhere between 20 and 24, at least as far as the Stadium Olympia is concerned, it's the very idea about how they must right now come with their own strategy of being able to nullify any natural disadvantage by being on the outer impact lanes, be able to gain as much ground as possible to start cutting in within essentially two different line of runners, all the way to being able to affect the turn around the Tampiras, the turning post, which obviously was one of the main stalwarts of these actual competitions. Should I say, because obviously I've only mentioned two of the running competitions, there are still two more to go. There's a distinct possibility that this one might actually belong to the third one, the dolicos and endurance race. But actually performing the dolicos depends on my mood that morning. It depends on how students have performed. So if they have performed admirably, I'll just have them do a couple of laps just for the ceremonial process sake of it. If not, I have no problem whatsoever having them do 18 to 24 laps because I just don't. When it came over, or when it comes over to the infamous or the notorious Tomodromos, I tried, I failed. Actually, I found this lovely gentleman right outside of the Phoenix Stadium. I'm sure he's there every other day. He is the one that usually wears this. Yes, you know who I'm talking about, so at least I don't have to say, or let's say, profess my aesthetic value on it. But let's just say that he has a shield, he has a final helmet and briefs. I did rent the entire equipment for him at an exorbitant price of 60 euros for half an hour. However, when I decided to actually go inside of the Athens Stadium so we could do a reenactment of said sport, the lovely people at Athens Stadium don't even think about it. So long story short, mission or abort said mission. That would pretty much wrap up the running competitions. The pentathlon, as many of you are aware, has usually been the subject of a lot of debate and a lot of discourse. Of the pentathlon that used to consist, for those of you who are not aware, of the javelin, the discus throw, the long jump, the wrestling, and also the stallion race. Let me just say that two of them, the stallion race and wrestling, are also standalone events. We've already talked about the sprint, and I will be talking about wrestling in just a few minutes, which means that we can now start focusing on the three that were only part of the ancient pentathlon in the form of the long jump with a very recognizable alpias, the so-called race, the javelin, and last but not least, of course, the discus. For time, or for reasons of time constraints, these are the two that I will happily show you reenactments or how we go about teaching the material. However, if you have any questions that relate over to the long jump, I'm more than happy to answer in our question and answer session. So let's in fact start with the javelin throw. The first thing is that the javelins that we tend to use are not that dissimilar to the ones that would have been used in antiquity. So first of all, when it comes over to their height, they are at different heights, which more or less correspond to the height of the individual athlete. When it comes over to weight, we have different, in fact, variants from 500 grams to 800 grams, which is our, let's say, consensus or belief that more or less would have been the equivalent weight of the ancient javelin. Like ancient javelins, we indeed have the spearhead or the javelin head, however, with no counterweight. The only distinct difference between the two, ancient and the ones we use, is that ours, certainly because of budgetary constraints, are made out of aluminium, and therefore, let's just say, they fare better throughout our often reconstructions, as opposed, of course, to the ancient ones, which would have been made out of hardwood or high-density wood. When it comes over to the main differences between ancient javelin throw and the modern, let's say, velocity, the technique or the throwing stance doesn't really change that much. But the one major difference has to do with the use by the ancient Greeks of what is known as the ampia, or amentum, if you prefer, in fact, the Latin term. that translates down to a leather or rope thong that would have been fastened around the shaft of the javelin, leading over to an actual noose in which you'd be able to see the positioning of the javelin resting on the palm of the athlete with his two fingers keeping it in place, while the other two fingers would have been inserted in the noose that you've actually right now created. The very idea of the amphibian would be allegedly to help create what would be the equivalent of a rifling effect. So the minute, in fact, that it is ejected, that reportedly or allegedly would lead over to faster RPMs, faster velocity, ergo translate into additional length being on. When it comes over to our own, let's say, practices and reenactments, this is where most of my students tend to struggle with being able to tie the dam, with all due respect, I'm keeping. However, let's just say that most of the time, and with help by their fellow students or of course myself, they are able to pull it off, which means that once again, on the basis of our pictorial reference, we try as much as possible to explore different ways that you would have with handling the javelin, the kind of trajectory that the javelin in fact should have right before the throwing motion. Like this. The way in which I want them, essentially at the very end of their try, to be able to bend over their elbow and at the same time start rotating the upper part of the shoulder, just like this, leading over to what essentially is the ejection of the javelin. All of the ejection in this particular respect actually relates over with the use of our feet. What we've been able to reconfirm, because frankly, experiments of these kinds have been done by others, is that we can achieve definitely 25 to 50%, if not more, increase in distance growth. We can definitely achieve 50% more velocity, which makes sense because the minute that the thing is ejected, this is where the rifling effect comes into being. And last but not least, RPMs to the point of 25%, which means that the javelin would be impervious to any sort of climatic or weather conditions. We have tried this, on a pretty much zero wind day. We have tried it on a windy day, and nevertheless, with the use of the amphibian, it has always worked in having what is or flying back straight or through. And once, of course, we want to pretty much reenact every single pictorial representation that we have. This one, shout out to the old guy, and therefore taking over the running one until right now, about to eject the javelin. This is exactly where the amphibian is about to unravel. And this is about where my body will right now take the entire reverse, that we call it, and therefore all of my body weight will be going forward. I have to show you this so you guys can understand that I'm also contributing to the best of my ability without dropping a kidney, while of course the reenactments actually come back. Same thing or same challenges is what we encounter when it comes over to much, or like in many respects, this has to do with the available or the nature of the available evidence. Whereas when it comes over to the disci that have been discovered throughout archaeological evidence, they tend to show a great variation or discrepancy when it comes over to the material, to their diameter, and obviously to their weight. What we do in class, and what we can also do, is to wax lyrical as to why this variation actually exists. We can talk about the use of different diameters and weights when it comes over to the youth classes that we know also participated in that. We can talk about the difference between dedication disguise, especially from drifters, as opposed to the ones that would have been used either for practice and training. And last but not least, we can also talk as much as we like when it comes over to games or venues using different standard, different weights, different diameters for their own individual games. For what it's worth, and again, not to belabor this, the disci that we actually use right now have a weight of 3.5 kilograms and a diameter of 22. So what we're trying to achieve or to use is or would be the mean, in fact, average. Evidently, another point of debate has to do with the actual throwing stance. given that the majority of our pictorial evidence tends to be either starting or, of course, influenced by the works of Myron and his discobolos. These have caused a lot of debate between us scholars as to whether this is in fact feasible, whether this would have been the exact way in which ancient discoboli would have thrown the discus. Most of the professionals that we have talked to, and most of the reenactments that we've done, have, I'm not going to say confirmed, but have allured, let's say, towards the point that no, this is again counterproductive and counterintuitive. I don't necessarily agree. Again, different in fact, hypotheses can be put down on the table. For one, we might be looking at just an evolution and a change that transpired throughout what is a long duration of discus throwing from the classical period all the way down to the Roman period. We might be in fact talking about a different technique. So perhaps some of the discus throwers, given that there is nothing in the regulation books to prevent them from doing so, might have thrown the discus by using their right foot forward, as opposed to others that might have chosen or preferred what would have been an open stance and therefore with their left foot forward. If you were to ask me on a personal again, and while we tend to reenact both sides of the coin, I am in fact a fan of the open stance, which again, through the use of professional athletes, we have found to be a little bit more, let's say, contributing, not only to the grip of the discus, not only to the way in which you can create that pendulum motion before throwing it, but last but not least, when it comes over to the throw itself. And this is exactly what, again, with the help of the students in my class, we in fact try to reenact and recreate. One of the biggest issues that we always have to face is how on earth do you get a grip over a discus that is bigger than a family-sized pizza? And the only way forward would be exactly by looking about how the fingertips would be able to hold it at the very edges, and most in fact of the weight being distributed in between the lower part of your palm and the lower part of, or the upper part, whichever way you think about it, of your forearm. All that leading essentially over to the throw, whereas I at least again tend to be a fan of the idea that ancient Greeks, when it came over to the ejection of the javelin right here, would have offered or followed a 45-degree angle. And therefore the optimum release would have been roughly at this point, which in addition to pictorial presentations also is or further corroborated by some narratives, in particular Statius in Theban, that actually makes a reference about the 45-degree angle. The last one that I wanted to broach has to do, of course, with the combat sports, in this case, when it comes over to wrestling. Again, our main, let's say, common reference point is the evidence that we have from either artistic or, of course, from literary sources. This is exactly why I have all of my classes trying as much as possible to reenact the basic positioning that ancient Greek wrestlers would in fact assume, where the major emphasis is once again on being able to maintain your body weight and your balance in order to be what I believe close to achieving what ancient Greek wrestling is all about. Offensive, counter-offensive, defending, and counter-offensive. And this is exactly the way we go about. Here we are very lucky, in fact, to be in the palestra at Messini. So the added dimension is we get to do it in the open and people take pictures of us. And therefore showing how different athletes, and once again of different sizes, weights, strengths, and the list goes on, are about to engage in a wrestling bout by, with of course my help every now and then, of being able to find ways of disarming their opponent and therefore going on an actual offensive move. This is something that we painstakingly, for each and every move that we explore in the classroom or in like specific venues, we try and recreate as much as possible. Right over here, for example, of showing them what the basics of a basic headlock would be, in which you're trying to bring the arm right underneath the neck of your opponent. Going on to, once again, more intricate moves, whereas you've seen, and following once again, the pictorial presentation that you see here is how you can potentially incapacitate them or throw him over to get the point, leading over to the three eventual points over to the three. Down to more, let's say, intricate moves that, as you can notice, right now involve one of the opponents going for an offensive action and how their opponent might be going for the counter-offensive, which, as I said, is one of the primary purposes or the primary ways in which these events were actually right now confirmed. A further example with the idea of what is known as a knee lock or a knee throw. Going down to, once again, this is in fact a waist throw, in which right now I'm trying to show students, and they were later replicated, about once again how you can use the upper part of your body in order to bring your opponent down through an offensive action. Ta-da! The mayor. It worked. Actually, I had these two students who decided voluntarily to actually go for it. Mind you, there is a big discrepancy in the size and the strength of these two. However, once again, with the proper technique, I can't remember her name for the life of me, but shout out to her because she was able to actually bring her opponent down. No students were harmed during the course of the enactment. I should in fact be throwing it out in the equation. Now, normally, or right now, I should have had my nephew being here, who would have helped me do a on-site demonstration of perhaps one of the most best known and celebrated moves that we have in ancient Pangratium, the so-called submission hold. He is not here, and therefore he has invoked my wrath and will be paying for it, and we'll actually see it home. So, in this respect, and just in fact concluding, one thing that I just wanted to stress or wanted to note was that in addition, of course, to this active and interactive teaching environment, one of the things that obviously students get to enjoy the most while they are taking a class like this in Greece has to do with a very, of course, close reference to the ancient venues, the ancient stadia or gymnasia that we use throughout all of our competition, and in many respects during our field trips. That would have obviously included Olympia, Nemea, Isthmia, and Delphi. As we already noted, the Palestra over at Messini, the stadium, or whatever you might call it, at Epidaurus, and therefore giving that extra added dimension, right? Not only to the teaching component, but also with regard to the final assignment, where my students are responsible for teaching the rest of the CYA student body about all the things that hopefully they've learned or retained throughout the courses. So, thank you.
How many students died?
None yet, none yet. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, I do have a 10% casualty rate, but so far so good. No blood, which is like alarming. A lot of sweat and some tears, but that's fine because I feed off their tears. Exactly. Well, I'm not going to answer that question, so that's the reason why I wanted my nephew here for the more heavy stuff. Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. Can I open the questions?
So I do this in my classes with military history. So I have two related questions to come out of what this, which I find fascinating. First off, do you have the student? We have the odds of how they run and everything else.
The whole idea is that when we approach each and every individual event, we look collectively at what evidence there is. The whole thing starts with a roundtable discussion about the nature of the evidence, but most importantly, as we're right now implementing or introducing practice within it, students get to test and therefore, like, to a certain extent, either confirm or let's say even refute some of the evidence that we tend to have. So that is a daily in fact activity that we do in class, yes.
The second part of my question is, do you ever ask students to actually consider, particularly for the javelin, the discus, and
I do long
to consider the labor or the effort to manufacture these tools that athletes are using, the labor of coach?
We do, because, but again, I would rather say, and just to be really honest, in brief. because other things that we also explore in class have to do with the training and the conditioning. So that pretty much removes us over from the performance of the sport itself. We look at the diet, okay? In fact, I am more than happy, or one thing that I do is to pretty much write down, again, on the basis of the evidence of what the potential diet of ancient athletes would have been depending on sport. But given that there are American students who become introduced to the gyros, I fail miserably. So at the very least, there's also a lot of theoretical component that goes in that will try and provide as much as possible a kind of holistic approach to what being an ancient Greek athlete was all about. Okay. Welcome.
Well, thank you. A wonderful display. I want to, you invited us to ask us about one of the things you didn't discuss, the long jump. Did you suss out what the point of the halteres were?
I have to be brutally honest with you because, first of all, what we try and do in class is, since the halteres are a given, that goes without saying. What we try to do is the different variations that I and many of my colleagues believe might have been involved in the process of going about. So we try with a static jump. We try with a running jump. We do it two different ways, either with the actual halteres in an upright position, or the halteres, which for me doesn't work, but that's only my personal preference, actually following the running motion. The big issue usually comes over with the ejection or not of the halteres. Every single time I've tried it with my students, let alone with a professional, they have found that retaining the halteres and not ejecting it, basically, again, decreases the length they're able to achieve. So the only way in which I can be, let's say, kind of, in favor of this practice would be that at the very top or heights of their jump, they would forcibly eject the halteres so that I can give them that extra little boost or kinetic momentum to go forward. It doesn't work. Each and every time it doesn't work. Again, from a personal experience, the other option that we actually tend to try out would be, I guess, the leapfrog approach. I mean, because many cases we hear about records are being like, that they get, like ancient jumpers do, that seems to be completely out of place. So some, in fact, of us tend to believe that perhaps the actual jump would have involved a leapfrog. So 5 jumps starting from one point all the way to the final jump at the halteres, and therefore the distance would be measured from where you started all the way down to where you ended. That would be the only thing that could potentially reconcile the records that we hear. But one of the reasons why I try to avoid talking about the long jump is because it is an absolutely dreadful experience. And most importantly, because I'll be honest, we're still really firing in the dark about how it was actually.
Okay, then I'm afraid I have one other question about the long jump theory, though. It is, do you do it on music? Because one of the things.
Yes. Albeit, unfortunately, while of course, like I do have a recording of an ancient Greek style of music, which I can assure you doesn't really work. The last time, and for reasons that I know I'm going to regret, I had students doing over rap. For them, it worked. For me, it was please let this like end now, because like, yeah, but yes, we usually do it because there seems to be sufficient evidence to suggest that musical accompaniment, again, was a means.
My first question is regarding the diet. And then another part would be, for how long would they be training to reach to like a maybe Olympic kind of, okay.
One thing that I usually mention in my class that scandalizes is that as an ancient Greek trainer, which is a role that I often assume, we like them young. So therefore, at the age of 5 and onwards is usually where you have your prospective athletes gathering in the gymnasium to be under the supervision of trained professionals. Usually because, while of course, in order to become a recognized and successful athlete, that involves a lot of time, a lot of energy and commitment. Nevertheless, we must always bear in mind that Many of the people, many of the athletes that do go to the gymnasium, especially at a younger age, might have other commitments as well. Many of them might have to travel over to said gymnasium. Many of them might be required in the field in order to like help with the family business, and the list of that goes on. So I am not going to risk even an educated guess about what the actual trajectory is. There are some narratives, there are some records. But the thing about ancient Greek athletic, and this I have to say also relates to diet, is that if you were to think of ancient Greek athletics as a phenomenon that started, let's just say, in the 8th century, 776, all the way down and including the final abandonment of ancient Greek athletics by the time of Christianity, you are looking at the 11th century. So the great array, if you will, of this period could easily necessitate great changes and frequent changes to the way that athletes trained, to the way that athletes were fed, and obviously to the way that the decision as to which sport would suit them better would also go. So let's just say that there are too many variables to provide what would have been a standard. Again, educated guess, or rather its best guess would be that in many cases, it would not have been that far off from what we would find as a daily staple in the tables of ancient Greek households. So there is a lot of emphasis indeed on bread and on cheese. There's a lot of emphasis on dried fruits, on nuts, things that are easily available. Wheat seems to have been once in the blue full moon, albeit we hear of later traders that tend to advocate more and more protein, which would have helped them again in the individual sport that we have. We have the athlete, or the winningest athletes of all time, Milo Cotton, who reportedly consumed 20 pounds of bread, 20 pounds of meat, and a big flask of wine per day. Yes, but apparently he was built like a mountain, so yeah, I'm not going to judge, I'm just saying. So yes, too many variables, and this is something that has obviously been, or had also been instructed by people who deal with modern day nutrition, especially when it comes to athletics, because this is like a process of ongoing change.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much.